Good morning, everyone. This is early morning, Saturday morning, and we're here to talk about the show Dissimulations at the Dennos Museum Center. And I have here with me my two assistants who have been integral part of putting the show together. So I'll introduce Jess and Margaret. Do you guys want to say hello?
Hello. Hi.
So my name is Jason Yee, and I'm the artist behind this exhibition, Dissimulations. And we had the opportunity to go install the exhibition at the Traverse City, Michigan Dennos Museum Center a couple weeks ago. And my work really evolves around the ideas of environment and creating a sort of immersive landscape for people to view and also to contemplate. My work uses materials that are seemingly humble in its origin, such as foam, plaster, and more of a hardware store materials, but I'd like to transform that into something that is almost seemingly fantastical, visually speaking. So what you see in the space are materials that you may or may not recognize, but you will eventually become to understand that these materials kind of exist out in the real world, not just in the gallery space. My environments that I'm creating in Dissimulation is of a specific environment. It's referenced off of a Korean peninsula environment. But certainly when I'm thinking about this work based on a geographical region, I'm also thinking about sort of a universal notions of what landscape is and what environment is for people and how we perceive that and how that perception is influenced by our cultural history and our personal experiences. So what you're seeing in the space are works that represent forms that sometimes appears, sometimes disappears. So what I meant to say was that for me, that I love the ideas of contradiction and also contradictions in perception of the work and perception of the materials that are being used to create these forms. So if we can maybe navigate towards the larger foam piece that's in the far end of the gallery, this foam piece is referencing a plume from a missile launch that was launched off of the East Sea of the Korean Peninsula. I say Korean Peninsula in general just because there's North and South Korea, and the Korean Peninsula references both North and South. And this plume represents this sort of a form that is amorphous in nature. It exists temporarily, and this ephemeral quality dissipates into the landscape and becomes part of the environment, part of what we breathe as far as air is concerned. I really love that idea of a distinct form that seemingly has some sort of a dimension and mass can dissipate and disappear. So I wanted to kind of mimic that sort of a phenomenon through creating these forms that are visually seemingly very heavy, but at the same time it's quite light just because I'm using spray foam, insulation spray foam that we're all used to seeing in something like a great stuff that comes out of a can to create this massive form. So there is a contradiction of weight versus a visual weight. So the weight or the lightness of it and the visual heaviness of the form because of the scale and because of the color. So a lot of people who are looking at this form, initially what they see is they see a metallic shape, metallic form, which we would understand as something that's very heavy. But as you get closer to it, you understand that there's a perforation to this form and you can see through the form. Therefore, sort of alluding to its dissipation into space, its disappearance into air. And as you get even closer to it, you'll be able to see that it is not metal, it is foam, therefore undermining our first perception of what this form is made of. And we can maybe get to the far white piece that's hanging off of the wall. So that piece that you're seeing is titled Allusion to Diamond Mountains. And Diamond Mountains is a mountain range in North Korea that has been revered by all of Korea. Koreans dream about, especially the South Koreans, dream about going to the Diamond Mountains. And the Diamond Mountains represent, really, it's just sort of a symbolic, there's such a strong symbolism of Diamond Mountains as part of Korean culture and our heritage. But it is in North Korea, and it's right now that South Koreans are not allowed to visit this beautiful mountain range. And it is called the Diamond Mountains because of its physical form of it being a very jagged, granite-topped mountain range. So it almost looks like a faceted sides of a diamond. And in 2008, there was a goodwill gesture on North Korea's part to invite South Korean tourists to visit the Diamond Mountains. And there was an incident on 2008 when one of the South Korean tourists crossed a line, a restricted area, went into a restricted area, and was immediately shot to death for entering into that zone. So I'm looking at these mountains as this sort of a glorious mountain form that especially the South Koreans, wants to visit, but at the same time, it is highly restricted, and it holds, these mountain ranges holds the North Korea's largest cache of missiles. So inside the mountains, there are caves and caves of missiles that's pointing towards South Korea. So for me, it's super interesting to think about how the South Koreans think of these mountains as the sort of mountains of reverence and mountains that they want to visit because of its beauty, but at the same time, within that beauty, there is a potential devastation of war and death. So once again, the contradiction and the conflict that I see within what we perceive to be something beautiful is interesting to me. And these mountains are made of miles and miles of drywall tape that I cut in half, then laid on top of each other to create this sort of waterfall-like structure. And it cantilevers off of the wall. So when you see the bottom of it, it comes out about 6 feet away from the wall. And when you see the bottom of it, it almost seems like it's levitating off of the floor. And I'd like to think of these diamond mountains that I created as sort of an apparition, and that it literally, for the South Koreans, they can only imagine what these forms are because they're not able to visit and see it for themselves. So it's our imagination that sort of takes place in us visualizing this form. And I think of apparitions, that things that appear and we imagine it to be, or sometimes we actually see something and our perception of seeing something that's fantastical is interesting, that I'm trying to relate these diamond mountains to. And in the center of the space, we have a bunch of logs. And these logs represent fences for me, ideas of boundary and ideas of lines and demarcation. And as I talked about the incident in 2008 with tourists entering into a zone that's restricted, I'm recalling those moments when you enter into this sort of an artificial line, then something, there are consequences that are prescribed or invented by human beings to have an outcome that is sometimes tragic. And ideas of protecting something, ideas of guarding against someone else is something that I'm trying to portray with the fences. And certainly these fences, for me, represent boundaries. And me as somebody who was born in South Korea and traveling across the Atlantic Ocean to live here in the United States, that ideas between borders between nations and us crossing certain boundaries have a special resonance with how I think about the world and how I think about boundaries. So these fences kind of represent that. And Jess and Margaret, they're going to be talking a little bit about how they are created, because they have been very, very integral to me making this work.
Yeah, so the creation of these logs was kind of a long, intensive process. We started with a wooden core for the logs, for which we placed magnets on. These logs are all magnetized and are designed to fit together in a specific way. And after the magnets were adhered to the logs, we then put circular foam pieces and built up the logs and the core of the logs with foam. That was then carved to give the illusion of ridges in real logs. And then there's a layer of plaster bandages and plaster over that. And then they are painted.
And what did you think? What did you guys think about what was the biggest challenge for you to consider for making this work?
I think that there's always a challenge when you are trying to replicate an organic form, but like with artificial materials. So you really had to take care with how we were carving it and how we were putting the plaster on. And then just the technical details of like not having too much plaster to block the magnets so that they like actually hold each other together. Those are probably our biggest like technical difficulties.
Yeah, I would second that. And also learning how to handle all of them with care, because plaster is really fragile, even if it doesn't feel that way after you've worked with it for so long. But I think really learning how to treat the objects with respect and handle them appropriately was a challenge at times.
So with the logs that you see in front of you, those are the logs that I am referencing. They're actual logs that are fences that I'm referencing off of certain Asian landscapes that I've traveled to and have seen that these are faux logs that are made of concrete. So I was super interested in looking at these logs that are seemingly trying to be natural and nature-oriented, but they're created out of concrete because of the practicalities of making them, and also practicalities of it surviving the elements over time. And the idea of us trying to replicate something and therefore us thinking about nature through an artificial forms is really basically what I'm also trying to create. So that's why these forms are as they are. Certainly the installation part of it, where you see the strewn about logs, I wanted there to be a perception of this being created or being destroyed, that these logs actually are animated, and it can be articulated or it can be configured in many different ways. Just like how we look at boundaries and borders, is a lot of times the boundaries and borders that we create are arbitrarily decided. And I wanted to sort of animate or seemingly animate these logs so they almost have a mind of their own to move about within the space, to whether to come together or in the very act of deconstructing itself to construct itself in a different configuration. So I wanted to activate that space through this sort of a midway point of construction and deconstruction. These logs are all magnetized, so they will never be in this space in the same way. And they encroach on the audience so that they are confronting the audience to potentially interact with the logs. And they will stick together almost like they are, they have this sort of a force to gather itself together to create some other form. Now, as we look far back into the space, there is a photograph that's adhered to the wall. And that wall, that photograph, is the photograph of an east sea as the sun is rising from the horizon. And it's the morning sun. And Korea is often called a land of the morning calm. And I wanted to kind of represent both the morning sun, the sunrise, but at the same time, I wanted to, in a very subtle way, orient the viewer to understand that when they look at that photograph, they're looking into the east. So it may be a mystery for a lot of people to know the direction of which direction they're looking at. But for me, this photograph is really critical in the experiencing of the entire installation. So that's the EC where the missile plume was born out of, the reference image that I am using to create these foam pieces, as well as the EC that is close to the Diamond Mountains. It's along the coast of the EC. So it's a super critical element to the overall installation that I am creating. And lastly, there are two pieces that I haven't really talked about, but these two pieces are similar in nature. They are actually paintings with a sumi ink with a curved surface. And they have this sort of a gaudy looking tinsel curtain that's been cut from a mylar sheet to create a veil to take our attention away from what is behind it. So the title of the show is Dissimulations, and it is about deception, and it is about veiling of something. It's about putting on a facade, but beyond that facade, there's a truth that's lurking that could be very insidious. And that's what I wanted to show with these pieces, is to create the allure of the reflection that almost like a waterfall. And when you think about waterfall, you think of what's behind that waterfall. And sometimes, we imagine there's behind that waterfall, there's like a secret stash of treasure or a cave that we can explore. So I wanted this sort of a sense of mystery behind this veil that which is seemingly very attractive and gaudy because of this reflective quality. And behind it, on what's actually painted on those curved panels, are the paintings of the plumes that I am referencing with the foams and everything else that's coming born out of the EC that also is part of the air that we breathe. So in conclusion, this entire exhibition is placed in a way that's very strategic for me, that it clues in on the viewer's orientation within that space, but at the same time, it also reveals the sort of the ideas of perception, how we look at things, and how what we see are not always what the reality is. And there is always a sort of a contradiction that's embedded within the reality that we see, and I'm trying to unearth that through the work.